So we're already recording. So good afternoon, everyone. Last time we spoke about Saqqara, and today we will talk about astrology in ancient Egypt. And today's presenter is Andreas Winkler, Dr. Andreas Winkler, our new co-worker at the Department of Egyptology at the University of Warsaw. As usual, Andreas, you have 1 hour for presentation and half an hour for discussion. So the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I should, for those who might not know me, I should also say that I'm part-time in Warsaw and part-time in Berlin. I do speak Polish, but I am from Sweden. And I work, my part-time in Berlin is part of a research project called Zodiac, Ancient Astral Science in Transformation. It's paid by the ERC, so I need to put the ERC logo on every PowerPoint I make for this. And we are together examining how the zodiac, which I will explain in a bit, was used around the Eastern Mediterranean, roughly 500 BC until 300, 400 AD. And what I'm presenting today is part of the research I am conducting within this project and elsewhere, and I've been working on these topics for quite some time. Otherwise, I'm also a specialist of Greco-Roman Egypt, but I work with material from all cultures. So if we talk about my topic here, ordering the sky, stars, and of different sorts in Egypt, we have already in the earliest texts, already in the pyramid text, hints at astronomical observation, astronomical practices. And this is something which goes through all of Egyptian culture. I will focus in today, however, on the later periods. Also, I will talk a bit about how this was used beyond only for astronomical purposes, and we have it also in divination. And divination is something which is attested also in Egypt quite early on, but it's roughly from the Middle Kingdom that we find written sources, although we can believe that this existed before. But it's only towards the end of Egyptian history, or in the late period, or the Greco-Roman period, where we move in and have something which I label as astrology. So if we look at the earliest sources which relate to any type of divination connected to the stars, celestial divination, we have the first clear instances of this in the New Kingdom. And one of the sources we have from the New Kingdom is the so-called Israel Stela of Merem Ptah, where you see that I have an extract in the lower right corner of the slide, which seems to allude to some people who scrutinize the stars and know all their spells when observing the winds. And we are not entirely sure what this refers to, but these people in this inscription, they utter some kind of prophecy, and this is how they are described. What we can think of is people who observe eclipses, for instance, of the moon, of the sun, and make predictions based on this. We also, from this period in Egypt, have scant remains of texts in Egyptian which seem to be translations of Babylonian texts or forerunners to something called Enuma Anu Enlil, which is a compendium of divinatory texts relating to the skies, to the celestial realm, and we seem to have this in Egypt as well. And it's probable that the people mentioned in this inscription are people dealing with that. So from the New Kingdom, at least, and onwards, we have clear attestations of celestial divination in Egypt. What you see to the left is a Roman copy of a text which must have been written in the 6th century BC. and we know that because of calendar conversions between the lunar calendar of the Babylonians and the Egyptian solar calendar. Again, this is a treatise on where eclipses and other phenomena relating to the moon and the sun are observed in order to make predictions about the future, usually a prediction which relates to the kingdom as such and not to individuals. But I won't talk more about the details here. I'm moving forward in time. And we already, from this period onwards, also can assume that the Egyptians have an idea that stars affect life on Earth, particularly the decans. And what I'm showing here is the so-called Naos of the Decades, which is from the 30th dynasty, which is a type of ritual calendar. But in this calendar, there are hints or quite clear expressions of how the appearance of certain days then connected to these decans affect life on Earth by producing different kinds of weather, spreading disease, and so forth. But I will focus today on the use of the zodiac. So what is the zodiac? The zodiac is a set of constellations developed in Mesopotamia. And we have the oldest references to constellations, groupings of stars which were envisioned as animals or something similar along the ecliptic, which is the path of the sun. So constellations along that path were ordered, grouped together, and we call that the zodiac. The first hints at constellations in this band of the heavens date to the 3rd millennium BC. And it seems to involve both Scorpio and Taurus, which are 180 degrees opposite of each other. Earlier on, there is in Babylonian sources, or I shouldn't say Babylonian or Mesopotamian sources, they talk about up to 18 constellations. Later on, they get reduced for purposes of astronomy to 12 constellations. Constellations is something different than a zodiac signs, because every constellation has a different size. They occupy a different part of, or an unequal length, or unequal longitude on the ecliptic. You can still use this for astronomical purposes, but it's much easier if you standardize the sections of the ecliptic, the 360 degrees of it, into 12 sections, each section having 30 degrees. These sections were then named after the constellations with which they were associated, but one should keep them separate. And this happened roughly in the 5th century BC. The earliest clear attestations, I think it dates to 410 BC. And this is what later on created a big revolution, a new paradigm in the astral sciences of antiquity. And this is something which spread across the Mediterranean and also came in to Egypt. This both were used for calendrical purposes. You could measure the movement of the celestial bodies against these, but also, obviously, as you can imagine, people started divining with help of this, and that is what we call astrology. So to just continue the introduction here, these 12 signs, the 12 sections associated with different animals or beings, are here given in the English names are given here. Obviously, they come from Latin, and with what calendrical event they are associated. So usually the zodiac in the Babylonian way of dividing it began with Aries, because it's there where the spring equinox occurred. That is when the night and the day are of equal length. Cancer is associated with the summer solstice, when the sun is at its height. Then you have Libra, where you have the autumn equinox, again, equal day and night. And then on Capricorn, when the winter, you have the winter solstice with the shortest day. And all of these events are important for where, for instance, people regarded the zodiac begins. In Babylon. It was often in Babylon, and even in Rome, it often began with Aries. In Egypt, it was not so simple. And the image you see, that's just a lid from a 1st century, probably AD coffin, where they depict a zodiac in a mixed style between typical Egyptian style and something which could be associated more with Hellenistic artistic style. So when does this enter Egypt? In fact, the earliest textual evidence we have, and it is a textual evidence, the earliest one we have, comes from a Greek language papyrus. It's Papyrus Hebe 127, which is a cultic calendar, meaning that it is a calendar over the year and on what day certain Egyptian religious feasts are supposed to be held. In this calendar, they give dates for when the sun enters one of what we think should be the constellations, not the signs. But it's written for a local temple, so it is, even if it's a Greek language document, it is for an Egyptian cult. Then we have another text, a demotic text, which you see depicted here. It's Ostrakon Strasbourg, the Demotic Ostrakon Strasbourg 521, which potentially already indicates the concept of the signs rather than the constellations. And this text equates the months with certain signs, because it is said that the 1st month of the Egyptian wandering year, as you know, the Egyptian year changes from every 4th year, it moves one day. We can date calendars when they are correlated. And here we can see that they correlate the 1st month of the Egyptian year with Scorpio. This fits roughly the mid-3rd century BC. So we can say, at least at this point in time, the zodiac became known in Egypt. And there are further hints at this period being the early Ptolemaic period, being the time when the Egyptians adopted the zodiac. And we only have it, but the copy, I should say, this is a school text probably of Roman date, so they just kept on copying an older text. And if there are anything, if I'm unclear, you are welcome to raise your hand and ask me to explain again. But I will move on now. Now, the zodiac, the idea of the 12 signs was, as I've already hinted at, used in astronomy, used for astrology. In Egypt, we know it. It decorates occasionally temple ceilings, primarily from the Roman period, but also from the end of the Ptolemaic period. It enters the funerary sphere, where, as you have already seen, can decorate coffins, and it can also be found on ritual implements, on different tools used in the rituals. Now, when we think about the zodiac and their names in Egyptian, you see them here. And what we then see, for instance, is that Aries is in Egyptian usually called Isu, or that's the old Ser, meaning ram or sheep, but it occasionally takes an alternative name for form the first one. And this is quite obvious that if it is the first sign in the enumeration of the 12 signs, you could give it this alternative name. It's written with the Tep hieroglyph. You will see that later on. Well, Taurus is called the bull. That's nothing very particular about that. Further on, we move on to twins. Gemini, just in Egyptian, means hetero, the twins or pairs. Genhej probably means crab, but if I'm correctly informed, this word is only attested in relation to the zodiac sign or the constellation. We don't have it in any other text, as far as I'm aware. We have then Leo, which is just called lion in Egyptian. However, occasionally it's also called the first one, with another word, hat. And you can see on the image here, you see my little arrow, I hope, and you see that, in fact, the lion can begin, in a way, the ordering, the enumeration of the zodiac. And the reason why you can do this is because in the beginning of the Sothic year, when Sothis rises heliactically, it does so in the end of Cancer, which means that Leo would be the first complete zodiac sign associated with a Sothic year. And that's what I believe to be the reason why the Leo is also called the first one, because according to the Egyptian concept of when a new year ideally begun, it would have begun when the sun is about to enter Leo. Virgo is, interestingly enough, not called virgin in Egyptian, but in fact a noble lady. Also quite interesting is the name for Libra, which in Egyptian usually is called the horizon. But if you see on this image, maybe it's too small, but you see it is in fact depicted as scales. But usually the word, when we find it written in text, it's called the horizon. However, there is at least one text which seems to relate to it as the scales. I will show that to you in a while. We go on, and the names seem to be fairly standard. Aquarius is called the water, or the image of the water, which is also interesting because it is, as you see also here in the depiction, it's a little Nile god pouring out water, and that's how it is depicted. Now we can think about the Egyptian names and what we know about the Babylonian names or the Greek names, and obviously the names are to a large extent similar. But in fact, the Egyptian names deviate a bit from this, and I will get back to that in 2 seconds. Here you see just a selection of writings for the zodiac signs, how they appear in certain texts. To the right, you see it in some horoscopes from a treatise, where in fact Aries is consistently written with the hieratic sign for Tep, the head, not the first one, while interestingly enough, Gemini are written with either 2 strokes, as you see in the middle, or with two eyes or 2 eyebrows. Why, we can wonder, but it is quite obvious that Gemini, the twins, were associated with Shu and Tefnut, the 2 first gods in creation, who are often actually referred to as the 2 eyes of the sun god. So this idea is also expressed in writing, not only in art. We can also see that Gemini quite often are depicted as Shu and Tefnut. If we move on to Cancer, Cancer is written with the spine and the rib hieroglyph, probably because there's some kind of association between the ribs and the legs of this animal, and the spine then being the animal itself. Leo is, interestingly enough, as I don't know if you see that so clearly here, often written with a knife. Why, we might wonder, why is Leo written with a knife? But this depends on the fact that Leo was imagined as a lion. And the idea is that Maihes or Meusis is also a god who has a lion face, and quite often is depicted carrying a knife of this sort. So it's in a way becomes a metonym for the zodiac sign. And then we see Libra depicted as a horizon. Scorpio is in certain texts depicted as a horse. They just write a scorpion sign. In other texts, they write a snake to indicate it is something associated with the ground. What I want to show here is that Libra can either be the horizon or, in fact, what you see here. This does not look like a horizon, but in fact looks like a beam with two and the cords holding the two pans of a scale. So clearly the Egyptians had also two names for Libra, where horizon seems to be the most common one. What is here, this I've just copy-pasted from Neugebauer's book, Egyptian Planetary Texts, and some of his translations into hieroglyphs are not entirely correct. For instance, when he talks about Leo, it is the hieroglyph, the front, this is the demotic version, obviously, the front of the lion. So we have an independent Egyptian set of names for the zodiac signs, which to a large extent correlates with what we know from the other cultures. So the question is, how did the Egyptians get their names for the zodiac signs? Well, if we start looking at the names of the Egyptian signs and the depictions, it seems quite clear to me that the Egyptians name the zodiac signs after the animal or after the image associated with each constellation or sign. Noble lady for Virgo, when the Egyptians saw this depiction of a lady carrying an ear of corn, they thought about a noble lady and not necessarily a virgin. The Babylonian image is a personification of a furrow associated with the goddess Shala. But it is only through the classical sources that they associated this female depiction with a virgin. And in Egypt, it is not necessarily so that a noble lady is the same thing as a virgin. And the word used is never used for a virgin otherwise. What is interesting about this image is the striking similarity between what we see depicted in the few Babylonian sources and the Egyptian ones. If we observe Leo in Babylon, it's always depicted as standing upon Hydra. And this is exactly what the Egyptians also do in Egypt. While in the classical world, the Greek world, Leo is depicted alone without the snake. So we can be fairly sure that images from Babylon reached Egypt. The Egyptians, instead of reading cuneiform text and trying to associate this constellation with those texts, just looked at the image, at least this is how I envision it, looked at the images and just described them with one word, and hence we have the Egyptian terminology for these things. So we can see that this intellectual transfer of knowledge comes largely through images and not only through texts, although texts would also have played a role here. I should briefly also mention that we have the planets, and the planets earlier in Egyptian history have a different association with different deities than they have in the Greco-Roman period. In the Greco-Roman period, it becomes quite clear that the same associations the Babylonian had with their planets become the main one in Egypt. For instance, if we think of Mercury, Suga in Egypt, or Sebek, Suga or Sebek, that's basically two different ways of writing a word which would have sounded very similar. They can also use metonymic symbols to refer to planets. And what do they use for Mercury? All of a sudden, Mercury can be spelled out alphabetically, but also they can use the book roll, or they can use a heart. Why? Well, because Mercury in Babylonia was associated with the god Nabu, who in Egypt, the Egyptian equivalent would have been Thoth, the god of writing, the god of wisdom. And obviously then a book roll makes sense in this connection, and the heart makes sense in as much as Thoth is often described in the texts as the heart of the sun god Re. So you can write the planet's name with the heart. Amun or Jupiter becomes associated with Amun, who is a god of wind, and thus you can use the wind symbol in demotic to refer to Jupiter. Mars is again can be written with the sign of a knife, similarly to Leo, because Mars is associated also with Myhes or Muses, the god of pestilence. In Babylonia, this is Nergal. So we can see that the Egyptians, in fact, take over these Babylonian ideas with which god you should associate a planet, and then make it into an Egyptian tradition. And what you see here, are just a selection of different writings for the planets from different texts, and this is just a small selection. And we can see that these associations are indeed originally from Babylon and did not necessarily come through Greek material, because this text, which I already have shown, begins with an enumeration of the 5 planets, and the way the planets are divided is inspired by how they would have done it in Seleucid Babylon. It was believed that Saturn and Mars were evil or maleficent planets, while Venus and Jupiter were regarded as beneficent. And they were divided then by the neutral Mercury, and this is what we see in this text as well. So these ideas probably entered Egypt by the 3rd century and quickly became rooted in Egypt and taken over, and this is what we then see in the end of the Ptolemaic period and the Roman period, when the Egyptians talk about these entities. So before I go on, I want to say that although we have the texts suggesting that it is in the 3rd century BC that the zodiac enters Egypt, we actually only start having a larger set of sources from roughly the 2nd half of the 1st century BC. And these sources here are just examples of what we have. To your left, you see it's a kind of calendar which indicates on what date the moon would become eclipsed, and they do that in describing which day and in what position on the zodiac in the ecliptic the moon had. So it says it will become eclipsed on this and this date while being in sign so and so. It is probable that this text, or the result of this, why they wanted to know when the eclipses occur, was for divinatory purposes. You could predict the future with the help of eclipses. At least this is what we think, but there is nothing which hints at this directly in the text. It's just a list of these dates and correlations. Then what we see in the middle is a horoscope, one of the earliest real horoscopes we have from Egypt. And what I mean by earliest, it records a date, the first known horoscopic date. This date is 48 BC, so it's year 5 of Cleopatra, but we can be fairly sure that this text is written later on, at least during the reign of Augustus. at the earliest. And the reason for that is that it's dated to year 5 out of 22. Obviously, Cleopatra had to be dead by the point that was written, because only then could they know that that she only reigned for 22 years. And interestingly, or finally, we have to your right something which is similar to what we have in the middle. It's a zodiac with planets plotted in, and it's a depiction of a zodiac on a papyrus which dates broadly to the 1st century BC. However, it can be dated. The date depicted, it depicts a date, and I can reconstruct that date, and this date is 56-55 BC. I will return to that text in a while. Now, around the same time, this is quite relevant, I think, is when we start having massive sources in Egypt, something is happening around the Mediterranean. So what you see here is, to your left, you have the round Dendra zodiac, which is roughly mid-1st century BC, and we date it to this period because the cartouches associated with the monument are empty, so this is something one associates with Ptolemy XII or Cleopatra. So the priest of Dendra decide to put this up by the end of the Ptolemaic period. Roughly simultaneously to your right, you see the so-called lion horoscope. This is a relief of a lion with the names of planets engraved in it and a picture of the moon. If you would try to date this because of the planetary positions, this can be dated. There are 2 possible dates, 109 BC or 62 BC. And it is assumed that 62 BC is a better fit, and it would commemorate how Antiochus of Commagene becomes a friend of Rome, basically a vassal king under Rome, and he wants to indicate this important date by depicting the skies in this monumental form. But this is a new way of expressing yourself in this period, which is suspiciously close in time to the Dendra zodiac. Also, not only these kings, or it's not only in Egypt and in Anatolia these things are happening. On the top and on the bottom, you see some Roman coins. It is quite well known that Augustus received his horoscope in 44 BC, and shortly thereafter started using the zodiac sign Capricorn as his star sign. There is quite a complicated history around this, but the important thing is that this becomes suddenly in vogue to use your zodiac sign in your propaganda. Above him, you see something which is, I find, quite interesting. It's a coin minted for Mark Antony, who is obviously the partner of Cleopatra at this time, and he starts using Leo as one of his symbols. And you can see that it in fact refers to Leo and not just a lion because of the star depicted above it. What is particularly interesting, I think, is that he also, if you see what the lion is carrying, it's carrying a knife. This is obviously inspired by Egyptian iconography. Not so strange considering his partnership with Cleopatra, but it is in fact interesting for Egyptologists to note this, that there is an Egyptian connection here. I should also say that it is in the 1st century BC when classical authors start introducing Egypt into, as, let's say, the cradle of astrology. Previously, it was a much stronger focus on the Chaldeans. It's still the main focus in these writings that I mentioned, Chaldeans rather than the Egyptians, but the Egyptians start entering the scene around this time. So when we look at zodiacs, in general. In Egypt, we find them, most of us think about maybe horoscopes or astrological texts, but we can also see them in temple ceilings. This one is an early Roman example from the time of Tiberius. In Dendera, it's a second zodiac. It's a second zodiac from the temple. We have seen one earlier on, and it's maybe not very visible on this particular screen, but it's just a nice photo that you have the whole row of the zodiac is like the coffin you saw before. It should begin with Leo, but you have the birth of the sun here, which is then associated with Sothis, depicted as a cow, and also the zodiac sign Cancer connected to it is also depicted there in looking like a scarab. And the cutout you have here is just an image of Capricorn, because it's quite a nice image, I think. So these rectangular zodiacs, or the round zodiacs for that part, what do they depict? Well, what we can see is that these monuments seem to depict the ideal new year. They stress the connection between the sun and Sothis, and being part of a temple, this is quite important. The temple is an illustration. It is a way of manifesting creation. So these zodiacs depict, in fact, the sky at the moment as the Egyptians envisioned the skies at the moment of creation. Here, this is important for us to realize this, because here we can see how relatively fresh ideas became deeply rooted in the Egyptian theology. Suddenly, you not only take in new ideas and make them your own in order to describe the world. This is something they would not have done 200 years or 300 years earlier. But by this time, after roughly 200 years, it is apparently okay to use these foreign traditions to depict something as crucial as the creation of the world. And the way the Egyptians divided it is, as I say, it's a focus on Cancer and Leo, Leo being the first, but Cancer is associated with heliacal rising of Sirius. And what is interesting is the fact that these zodiacs, the depictions of the zodiac signs, also depict planets. They can depict the planets in something we call the nocturnal and diurnal houses. This is what you see on your right. So the sun only has a diurnal house, and the moon only a nocturnal, but all the other planets do, in fact, are associated with two zodiac signs each, one for the day, one for the night. In astrology, when a planet was in its house, it was extra powerful. But you see that this astrological concept is used as a depiction of how the birth, it's used to also depict the sky at the birth of the world. What is interesting here is that it is physically impossible for these constellations to depict an actual date, even if you go back 1 million years or 2 million years, or go in the future for so many years. The fact is that certain planets cannot be further away from each other, or can have the distances as they show here. It doesn't really matter. It is an ideal, envisioned moment in time when the world was born. They can, in other zodiacs, they can show what we call the exaltations. It is an originally Babylonian idea. I also think that this is an alternative view on the creation of the world. while I should say that the houses, the organization of why you have first, where you have Virgo and Gemini for Mercury, and then Taurus and Libra for Venus, depends on the so-called geocentric view of the universe. So the planets which were closest, viewed as closest to the Earth, were then put in the upper part of this circle. That's originally a Greek idea, but it was adapted into Egyptian patterns. And so these zodiacs can depict this. What is quite interesting is that, and this phenomenon is called thema mundi. What is quite interesting is that it is said in the classical literature that who were in fact the people who first discovered the horoscope of the world. Obviously, the Egyptians. This is in some of the canonical astrologers or people writing about astronomy in antiquity. They associate this with Nehepsos and Petosiris, two legendary astrologers. Nehepsos is, in fact, King Necho II, and Petosiris is probably a misreading of the name Petesis, also being a legendary sage in Egypt. However, it is some later texts also attribute the discovery of this world horoscope, the birth of the world, or the horoscope of the world, to a certain Thrasylos. Thrasylos was the court astrologer of Tiberius, but he was Egyptian. So this is an Egyptian idea, which in itself builds on concept, both Greek and Babylonian ones. And this is first seen then in these Egyptian temples of the Roman period. I also mentioned that the zodiac is not only found on temple ceilings, we also see them here on some ritual implements, such as this libation bowl of a Roman date, or which depicts the zodiac, in this case only 10 of the 12 signs, and in the middle you see Isis riding a dog. That should also indicate Sirius or Sothis in the late Roman depiction thereof. So this is what we can say a kind of a mixed form of art which we find, and we assume that these bowls were used, for instance, with the New Year celebration for libations. To your right, you see an astrological tool, a so-called pinax. You use this to illustrate the positions of the planets when you were doing an astrological consultation, often perhaps in the temple. And here you just see one example of a text mentioning that one should not show one's client how one did the calculations when one was laying out the different gems which you used to illustrate the positions on these boards. But this is something I will probably not have time to talk more in detail about. What is also quite interesting for the zodiac and how it became legitimized in Egypt is not only that it starts being used in the temples to illustrate the creation, you also start finding it in the funerary sphere. We have already seen some images of coffins, where usually the zodiac can surround an image of the sky goddess Nut, or in fact, they can surround something else associated with the skies, the sun and the moon, or similar. What is while many of these depictions do usually only show a schematic new year associating the image with the rising of Sothis, the Sotic year is important here. Some monuments, both tombs and coffins, take this one step further. What we see here are two examples of this. To your right, you see a coffin which belonged to a unfortunately, it's lost today, but it belonged to a priest called Heter. And after putting in a schematic depiction of the zodiac, Heter, or somebody who knew his date of birth, wrote over or in adjacent to the images of the zodiac signs, names of planets in Demotic and Hieratic. And through this, we can date the birth of Heter to AD 93. He died in, if I remember correctly, 125, but I'm not sure anymore. And to your left, we see a similar thing, but then this tomb was already, from the start, planned to be decorated in such a way that you depict the zodiac signs, which you see here with 2 zodiacs, and then the planets are plotted according to certain dates in the mid of the 2nd century AD. Why was this important for the funerary sphere? Well, I think the best interpretation is that obviously the deceased wanted to follow the path of the sun in the hereafter. You are supposed to be part of this divine entourage in the hereafter. And this is what some of these coffins depict. However, and you do that in the new way through the zodiac, because that becomes the new way of depicting the sky instead of the old way of doing it with the so-called classical sky image. However, since you are supposed to be recreated or reborn in your coffin, they recreate the skies at the moment of your own birth in order to facilitate the birth in the hereafter. Although we have only a few attestations, these 2 date to the mid 2nd century AD, and this is something we see from the early 2nd century AD. There is a group of coffin which we refer to as the Sota group, which usually depicts the zodiac on the coffin lid. One of Sota's sons, Ammonius, also does this thing, but interestingly enough, he singles out Capricorn and puts it above the head of the goddess Nut, while traditionally it should be located at the bottom of the feet. Why did he do this? Well, we do know that he was born in what would have been the Julian month of January. And it was probably a way of depicting where the position of the sun when he was born. So this is basically the same idea as we see earlier on, but not as detailed. Only one sign is singled out. What is furthermore interesting with this coffin, and which brings us back to last week's presentation and the legitimacy of astrology or astronomy in this sphere, is what we see on the right image on the bottom left. On the foot and the head side of the coffin, there is a depiction of 2 figures who we can identify as Amenhotep, son of Hapu, and Imhotep. Imhotep and Amenhotep were at this time saints in Thebes. These coffins comes from Thebes, and they are associated with an array of different phenomena, but they are primarily gods which are supposed to guide the deceased through the valley, but also they are associated with healing. Since Amenhotep died quite young and probably of some kind of disease, people have suggested that depicting these 2 deities on the coffin would help him as an act of veneration for having prayed to them during his lifetime to get better. However, since both characters are associated with astronomy as well in this period, you might think about them as guides through the stars. Amenhotep is not as strongly associated with this as Imhotep. Imhotep is becomes in fact often mentioned in astrological texts from this period as the author of an astrological treatise. So I suggest that the reason they are put on these coffins is to use their authority, their wisdom, to go through the skies. They also are a practical help because they knew their way around the stars, so to speak. Imhotep is also an interesting character because we know him from a lot of inscriptions in the Greco-Roman period. He's really an important sage, a saint, if I may use that word, for wisdom, for all kinds of arts. And he is quite often referred to as the chief lector priest, royal scribe, and sage. And what is quite interesting that from the 3rd century AD, we have inscriptions belonging to astrologers. And these people style themselves in a way which is very reminiscent of Imhotep, how Imhotep was remembered. So here you have one example where the astrologer, the person, calls himself chief lector priest of the king of Kush. Then he is a sage, Rech-it-ichet, and he's a royal scribe as well. He then starts to refer to his astral knowledge through priestly titles, but we should not really think about an astral cult as much as a way to express areas of astronomical knowledge. So he is the prophet of Sothis, the overseer of the path of the moon, the priest, the one priest of the 5 living stars, the 5 planets, as well as the one who knows the times of obscuration of the sun and the moon. That is, he can do lunar or predict lunar eclipses. The interesting thing is here that he really doesn't really refer to himself as an astronomer or astrologer, and in fact uses titles which are associated with Imhotep. Now, let me return to this draft, the Greek papyrus. And I want to ask the question, is this in fact a Greek papyrus? What do we see? So we see just a scrap, it's a scrappy papyrus. It is a palimpsest. It's once was used for a count of grain, probably from the end of the 2nd century, early 1st century. Then it was reused again for another account. Then one of the sides was poorly washed out and somebody drew the image we see. What we see is a badly drawn, although quite elaborate circle. It has some kind of decoration, some embellishment, as you can see. The squares are separated with double strokes. It's a double border, although poorly written. And it contains the names in Greek of the name of the zodiac signs. What we see at the top is just the end of the sigma in Krios, Aries. Then we can understand that it goes counterclockwise up to end in Pisces. This square would have belonged to Leo. Here we have Virgo. And what is interesting is that we can see that they write names of planets outside the circle. What we see above Aquarius is Mars and Jupiter and the beginning of the name of Mercury, which means we need to have the Sun and Venus close to Aquarius. We can see they are not in Pisces over here, so they are probably in Capricorn. And in fact, Mercury is probably also in Capricorn, and this allows me to date this text, because then I can place at least 4 out of 5 planets and the Sun as well. Venus and Mercury are never further away than 48 and 28 degrees from the Sun. And since we see that a lot of signs are empty, we know that there's nothing there as well. So we have a date on an image, and in the middle, what do we see there? Well, we see a dog. What could this be? I think this dog is an early representation of Sothis as a dog. The question is, when did this happen? Traditionally, the Egyptians would depict Sothis as a cow, but only in the Roman period, 2nd century, we start having more, it becomes more common to have dog figurines. These dog figurines usually have no writing connected to them, but people have assumed they depict Sothis. But when did the Egyptians start associating Sothis with a dog, which is a basically Greco-Roman concept? Well, the papyrus I mentioned in the beginning, Papyrus High B127, associates, refers to Sothis as the dog. We know that Greek astronomical literature was read in Egypt at this time, and they refer to this, and some of this literature circulated in a temple environment. Finally, Diodorus, when he describes Egypt, talks about a hieratic inscription or hieroglyphic inscription, which he then translates into Greek. This Greek rendering of the inscription is suspiciously similar to some Greek epigraphical evidence referring to the cult of Isis, where the goddess says that she rises in the star of the dog. So somewhere here in the 2nd century or 1st century, the Egyptians had already accepted that Sothis is not necessarily a cow, but can also be depicted as a dog. How that was legitimized in Egypt is not entirely clear, but it's obvious that the priests start accepting and are very open-minded about foreign ideas in this sphere. I unfortunately speak too slow or say too much about other things, so I will not go into proper astrology, but what I hope that I've been able to illustrate is how the Egyptians during the Greco-Roman period and the Ptolemaic period, in fact, are able to take a basically foreign concept, make it into their own, and associate it with individuals which would give, or entities which would give this cultural credence in Egypt. So the planets become associated with Egyptian gods, obviously based on a foreign model. The so-called founding fathers of astronomy, astrology, are legendary figures in Egypt, but the Egyptians have no problem in also expressing these things through a foreign imagery as the dog. The papyrus is written in Greek, but we should not assume that it represents a Greek idea. It in fact represents a very, very Egyptian idea. And with that, I say thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Wow.
I
think
understandable.
Yes, but I think you said just like 5% of what you know. And I think we need to continue. But now it's time for a discussion. So since there are just few of us, I think we just can just fire away. Yes.
Thank you for your lecture, Andreas. It was great, both interesting and engaging, and at the same time, a little bit, at least for me, stupefying, because the lot of information you provided us with is amazing. Just one question which troubles me, because I cannot imagine how it occurred that the new zodiac, the Greek or Greco-Roman zodiac, supplanted the earlier images of constellations. Can it be determined somehow? was it like the new things came and the old things fell into disuse, or did they exist simultaneously for different purposes, perhaps?
Yes, so I think the best, easiest way to illustrate, well, the image I have here of the Dendra zodiac is a bit not very clear, but well, this is also a bit, let me turn to this one. Maybe it becomes a bit clearer now. So what you see here, even if this is a late example, that you can see that they depict Nut, and around Nut you have the traditional images as well. Both on the left and right, you can see, for instance, the bull's leg or the bull, the meschetio, the old, the plow, right? And the man spearing this. And this is an imagery which we know already from the Middle Kingdom, I think. So they had no problem combining these two. And how I imagine it would have been back earlier than this, obviously we don't have the first instance when this happened, is that you have the traditional image upon which you put the zodiac. And eventually the zodiac pushes out the traditional image. What is also interesting, what happens, and I didn't have so much time to talk about this, is that the 36 traditional decans, we actually don't understand really what they are and what they should be. Some of them we know, but there are different ways of interpreting them, is that they become, at least the names of them, become associated with the zodiac signs. We have 12 zodiac signs, 36 decans, meaning that each zodiac sign can cover 3 decans. So it means that, for instance, when they do astrology, they can say, well, planet and so happened in this zodiac sign, or they can say it happens in a decan, which is then a sequence of a zodiac sign. So there is a strong effort in combining the traditional image or the traditional ways of dividing the sky with the zodiac. The zodiac, exactly how it came about to become so popular, this is not really understood, and we don't know if you can talk about a unified theory for the whole Mediterranean area. It is quite clear that in Egypt, the priests pick this up. It is, in a way, a top-down approach. They are interested in this because they might realize the advantages of this new system for calendrical purposes. Once this has become used just as a fixed point for calendars, they start saying, hey, we can actually use this. What I find fascinating is that from the 3rd century to the 1st century, this just goes from being a way of organizing your time to become the way you can depict creation, which is, in fact, it becomes part of the cosmology of Egypt, as if it was always there. And exactly why, how this happened, we don't know. We just go from what we have in text and suddenly it just appears in the images. But the interesting thing is that it seems to happen simultaneously in Egypt as in other parts of the Mediterranean. Suddenly it comes, there's a prominent, some kind of wave.
It's fascinating. Thank you very much. And thank you for the reference to Imhotep. It seems that that times have a lot to say about him.
Yes.
And,
So what is interesting is that many of these texts say that you have this Petosiris, for instance, he found a papyrus in a box which was written by Imhotep in the time of Joseph.
I wonder where their knowledge came from. What could they know about Imhotep and Joseph?
There is
evidently both were quite well known to them, but what was the source?
Well, if I assume right, that there is a very strong tradition, or at least from the New Kingdom, to refer to Imhotep as a wise person, right? And the interesting thing is that it pops up suddenly in Thebes. You have this big, well, Polish excavation has explained that.
Certainly, but it could not have started from nowhere.
Yeah.
There must have been something, some source.
Yes.
But
And
it's elusive, of course.
yes.
But
And it's just
it would be.
No, I find it fascinating that these characters, right, become associated
Exactly.
with something which is clearly very, very new, and they try then to push it back roughly 2,000 years, if not more.
Well, thank you.
Okay, any other questions? Daniel.
I guess to lend it more credence or something like that, you know, just to provide some sort of origin of it. It's about Imhotep. Anyways, yeah, it was super interesting. I was wondering that you kind of mentioned somehow just a few minutes ago the fixedness of the system. Before that, at the beginning of the presentation, you just mentioned very shortly about the moving year, the Egyptian moving year.
Yes.
And I was wondering if this has anything to do with it. I mean, with the fact that one of them seems to be a little bit more fixed, like maybe they try to use it as a point of reference. I don't know. I'm just speculating.
It's an interesting idea. Thank you for that question. The Egyptians have, what can I say? They have a troublesome relation to the calendar. It is difficult because on the one hand, you have different calendars in Egypt. You have the official calendar with the wandering year. You have a lunar calendar to which you connect different feasts, and then you have the rising of Sothis. Ptolemy III, he introduces the first version of the Alexandrian calendar because he complains that feasts which were supposed to take place during summer now take place during the winter, and feasts which took place during the winter now take summer.
Yep.
So, and this is it's last quarter roughly of the 3rd century. I do think there might be, let's say, his reforms might be an attempt to standardize it because they might have gotten the idea from, let's say, the introduction of the zodiac signs, or with the introduction of the zodiac. Previously, we have these translations of calendars which clearly happened before. We have no attempt at reforming the calendar. This is something which comes in the Ptolemies, but it's quite a difficult history because we also have, is it Ptolemy III also? It was recently published a calendar which celebrates when they deify Arsinoe, and they introduce 25 leap days in a year or something like that in order to be able to have a feast within a particular month.
Oh, God.
It is completely outlandish how they do it. Apparently, we need to have these feasts for 50 days in a month, which is only 30 days. How do we do that? Well, you start introducing leap days just randomly. It's very complicated. It's really recent. I have not understood all the details. But there's something happening with the appreciation of time when you maybe mix ideas. So there's certainly much to dig in this.
For sure. One more thing is that it's just an idea that came to my mind when you were talking about the Leo and the knife sign, and the connection seems to be Myhes's iconography. I mean, that's definitely much closer than what I would like to say, but perhaps there's a connection there as well. So in the Spells Artemidos, the inscription talks about the locality, the valley, which is there as something like translatable as the Valley of the Thorn, and it's written very often with this knife sign. And I remember reading about it, that there's like some sort of speculation that the knife is connected to the lion because the lion has the claws and stuff, and things like that. And we know that the pachet of the spouse Artemidos was even in the Ptolemaic times something revered and referred to. So I don't know. This is absolutely just an idea. I can send you some references to it. Maybe you can, look into it. Perhaps it gives you like another perspective on this.
Yeah, no, that's I'm happy for anything. The thinking is here that cats are associated with knives, as you say. Maybe it's because of the claws, but this is the association they make with a knife, and then the knife in itself becomes a metonymic symbol for anything feline, right? When it comes to Leo, it's obviously a lion, and also Mars was associated as a lion, and the writing of these signs and the differences, the ways they can express it, is also quite, if you ask me, interesting. Here are just some. What I should say, Neugebauer didn't understand everything. He wasn't not an Egyptologist, so he might not have understood exactly what each sign represents always. But when we, for instance, look at the writings of planets in some of these texts, I have made some explanations here. What Neugebauer thought as 9 in fact should be understood as a lotus determinative, and the lotus also is pronounced, has a phonetic value of tua, like Necher Dua, morning god. That's the Egyptian name for Venus. In some of the text, interestingly enough, Saturn is depicted as a man standing with his arms up, and Saturn in Egyptian is Har Paka, the bull, and obviously arms up means Ka, the bull. So they find different ways of writing this. But if anyone has a good suggestion what this sign is for Mars, it's a hieratic sign, but nobody knows what it is.
Are there any other versions of it? Like
it looks like that in a particular corpus of text. I think it is some weird writing of an arrow. But I know
would make sense with Mars,
yeah.
No idea really. Well, the Saturn with the car, that's cute actually. I like that. No car arms, I also find it very fascinating how they adopted like into context as well. Straight like coffins and that they just, of course, they were familiar already with the stars and constellations, but not necessarily this system. And then they were like, novelty, let's take it straight away.
But it is fascinating how they allow these originally foreign concepts suddenly become one of the most important things. This is the most important place in the temple, right?
Yeah.
You take the finished creation, okay, maybe not the most, but one of, or in the coffin, that you actually incorporate something. You have a 3,000-year-old tradition. You could continue with that. No, they're actually willing to do something new. And I think this is an important, how can I say, in general, I think it's important when we look at Egypt, we have often thought about this being quite conservative, but perhaps there is more innovation under the surface than one often wants to acknowledge.
But is there anything comparable, like to this in the temples of
early periods?
No, of Ptolemaic ages. So that, because if they took the system of the zodiacs as such, I would have said, that something like, yeah, they took a liking to it because it was a fad. It was like something like that it was like, I don't know, in the zeitgeist of the Hellenistic times or something, and But then I would expect something else as well to end up, not only the zodiacs. So
what I didn't speak much about is that when well, in Egypt you have your own tradition of things. In Babylon you have your own tradition, but around, well, after Alexander, we had the Hellenistic period, right? And what we see in sources is that quite often when they refer to astronomy, it's for the 2 first centuries BC, it's quite often they refer to Chaldeans, very rarely Egyptians. I mean, there is some, but the majority is Chaldean. And suddenly in the 1st century, the Egyptians become more prominent. So something is happening, whether it is political reasons, but there is this is something I'm looking into.
Okay, any other questions? If no, I have one, but this is pretty naive one, so I apologize. Why does Leo stand for the first one you showed on this
because
slides? Yeah.
Yes, we can, well, it's best to show that on a coffin. Well, you see, Leo is, in a way, begins. So these coffins are not dissimilar from how things could be depicted on the temples, because they have 2 kinds of zodiac, the round ones, the round dendra, or rectangular ones. And when Sothis rises, it does so by the very end of Cancer. So very soon after the heliacal rising of Sothis, the sun enters Leo. So in a way, the Sotic year, you have the first zodiac sign associated with that year, such a year, is Leo. And this is one of the reasons it begins. And there are astrological texts which are obviously organized in different ways, but some of them begin with Aries, like you go through, okay, first you look what happened in Aries and so forth. Some of them begin, in fact, with Leo. So in the Egyptian year, because that was roughly when the traditional Egyptian year, according to the Alexandrian calendar, would have begun.
Thank you. Any other questions?
Apparently not.
Apparently not. Okay, so
Good stuff for think, certainly, but not necessarily for questions immediately.
Yeah, so I think you are going to develop on that subject on our museum night.
Yes, but then I will speak, in fact, about proper astrology and not these images. That's in fact.
Yeah. So if the rest of you does not know yet, on 13th of May, there's going to be a museum night held by the Faculty of Oriental Studies, and not only will we have, and to take this year's topics is, well, curses and spells, yes,
And blessings.
and blessings. And
that's it.
yeah, so there are 2 parts. One is the presentations about topics of blessings and cursings in different African and Asian cultures, and the other part is what we call the game, which is when you can come and visit a spot when you will be given a blessing.
Oh,
very good.
You can also curse someone.
Yeah.
Well, this is what I wanted to ask.
Yeah, they'll be on your place, the Egyptology. Yes, the Egyptologists decided that this year they were cursed people.
We should put up like a gate. He who enters,
Excellent.
So, yeah, but anyways, before that, we're going to have another archaeological Archaeo-Oriental seminar on the 8th of May. Joanna Cisielska will talk about the results of her project. Her project was about Sudanese women as keepers of the tradition. So the abstract will be sent before the meeting. So thank you all and enjoy the rest of the day. Let's hope it will get warmer soon. Also in Berlin, not only in Warsaw, but also in
Yes.
yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Bye.